What do these apples have to do with one artist's sexual desires, and what does it mean for how we interpret art? So this video is going to center around a 1968 essay by Meyer Schapiro called The Apples of Cézanne, an essay on the meaning of still life. In it, Shapiro claims that Cézanne's still lifes with apples represent displaced erotic interest. But before we dig into that, let's get some context on Cézanne. Cézanne was born in 1839 in Aix-en-Provence. He grew up in the French countryside and was childhood friends with notable French writer Émile Zola. In his work, he's often referred to as a post-impressionist and impressionist painter. His work was really important in bridging the gap from Impressionism to Cubism and Expressionism and increasingly abstract approaches to painting. Scholars generally divide his work into three categories: the dark period, during which he created many violent, brooding, and dark canvases; the Impressionist period, in which he worked a lot with the tradition of Impressionist painting that was around him in France at the time; and the mature period. This is when we get a lot of the still lifes with apples. So now that we have a bit of context on Cézanne, let's talk about Chapter 1, the Shapiro Essay. So Shapiro starts his essay by focusing on this painting, painted between 1883 and 1885. The painting is called The Amorous Shepherd. He especially focuses on the male figure's offering of apples. Cézanne knew of apples as a symbol of love and even erotic desire. He gets right to the point and posits his main thesis. He says, "Does not the association here of fruit and nudity permit us to interpret Cézanne's habitual choice of still life, which means, of course, the apples, as a displaced erotic interest? In Western folklore, poetry, myth, language, and religion, the apple has a familiar erotic sense." So this video is going to revolve around that question and try to use it as a jumping off point to try to understand the purpose of interpretation in art. Dark painting, dark thoughts. Do Cézanne's feeling on women affect his painting, and how? Before we jump directly into still lives, we should examine Cézanne's feeling towards women and how these feelings affected his art. When Cézanne moved to Paris at 22, he remained as shy and fearful as women as in his hometown of Aix. From the obsessed imagination of the unwillingly chaste artist came paintings of a crude sensuality, even rape, orgy, and murder. That is a crazy thing to say. Like, unwillingly chaste, like involuntarily celibate, like an incel? Definitely the connotation of incel didn't exist at the time that Shapiro was writing this, but like us imagining today Cézanne as in like doomer incel kind of reads. We'll get into it. So aside from Shapiro calling Cézanne unwillingly chaste, this is an important point in the essay because it's going to be used as a stepping stone to make the argument about the apples, which is that Cézanne's paintings from this period stem from his feelings towards women. So let's break down this point. We want to know first what Cézanne's feelings about women were, and second, we want to know how those feelings affected his painting. Shapiro kind of knocks out both of these points in a damning quote. Renoir recalled to his own sons years afterwards a conversation with Cézanne in which the latter had said, "I paint still lifes. Women models frighten me. The sluts are always watching to catch you off your guard. You've got to be on the defensive all the time, and the motif vanishes." This is an incredible illustration of Cézanne's misogyny and fear of women. From this quote, we can understand that Cézanne's misogyny affected his work and especially his decision to paint still lifes later in his career. But did it affect his early work, the work that portrayed rape, orgy, and murder? Shapiro would say yes, and he grounds this argument in some readings of paintings. The first painting he talks about is Pastoral, which was painted in 1870. It gets pretty Freudian here, so bear with me. The desires implied in the paired figures of the naked and the clothed reverberate in the eroticized thrust of the trees and the clouds and their reflections in the river, and in the suggestive coupling of a bottle and a glass. Cézanne's picture has nothing of the original, which was Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. Coolness and air of detachment. There are in his version a moodiness and vehemence of execution that betray the artist's uncontrollably intense feelings. He also analyzes pieces such as A Modern Olympia from 1873, which is a blatant cover of the original Olympia from Manet, which is a very famous painting, potentially the beginning of modernism as we know it. Who knows? But he says, striking is the regular presence of still life in these scenes of debauch. He suggests that Cézanne is projecting a version of himself in these conceptually violent paintings and pointing out a man, much like the painter in his ungainly form, a bit of a roast, sits in the foreground, gazing at the naked woman crouching on a bed. And we can see here on the table these little still life and fruits. He looks at another painting, which is especially violent, Bacchanal, which was painted from 1875 to 1876, and he says, the exceptional painting of a Bacchanal with 4 pairs of nude women and men struggling with each other in the landscape is a scene of explosive violence. Cézanne's pictures of the nudes show that he could not convey his feelings for women without anxiety. In his painting of the nude women, where he does not produce an older work, he is often constrained or violent. There is no middle ground of simple enjoyment. Now, definitely with this quote, there's a problematic, male painter, male gazy enjoyment of, the middle ground of simple enjoyment that we know today doesn't exist. But overall, I think Schapiro makes a really compelling case for himself that Cézanne's feelings on women affected both his early work and his later work, as he admitted in the quote. Many of these pictures paint not only real physical violence in their depictions, but there's an uneasiness in the painting method itself. It's kind of anxious. The figures are often contorted and unnatural, and they're complemented by similarly unnatural, violent landscapes that engulf the frame and feel kind of claustrophobic and writhing, almost. You can see it a lot in Bacchanal. In short, there's a reason why this was called Cézanne's dark period. Chapter 1.2, The Art of Still Lives. This doesn't really have to do with the rest of the essay, but I love this painting. Shapiro says, he paints the famous still life of the black clock and the giant seashell with reddened mouth, exceptional objects that invite divination of a strange mood. So before we get to the question of the displaced of erotic interest in the apples, Shapiro addresses the other qualities in still lives that may have been overlooked by reducing it to a psychoanalytic reading. He says, one may suppose that in Cézanne's habitual representation of the apples as a theme by itself, there is a latent erotic sense. This sketchy formulation, suggested by psychoanalytic theory, leaves much unexplained, I must admit, in the painter's devotion to still life. It abstracts a single factor from a largely hidden, complex, and changing process of artistic work. To rest with the explanation of still life as displaced sexual interest is to miss the significance of still life in general, as well as important meanings of the objects on the manifest plane. And Shapiro actually says a lot about the significance of still life in general, as he says. He suggests that still lives should be counted as major works, and changing the way that we look at still lives, I think, is one of the greatest contributions of this essay. Why should a landscape or a portrait be counted among masterworks, but still life is kind of overlooked and disregarded in some senses? He claims, in fact, that Cézanne's still lives were some of his most groundbreaking works and would lay the framework for innovations in cubism and later abstract art. So in addition to recognizing the merits of still lives as masterworks, Shapiro also argues against a common idea with these paintings, the apple paintings in particular, that the objects chosen for still lives don't matter, that they are only picked for the painter to explore painting itself, the qualities of painting itself, rather than the qualities of the objects. This idea that the apples, quote, are nothing more, it is supposed, than pretexts of forms. Shapiro wholeheartedly rejects this idea. In one of the most beautiful passages of the essay, the point really comes to a head. The objects chosen for still life painting, the table with food and drink, the vessels, the musical instruments, the pipe and tobacco, the articles of costumes, the books, the tools, the playing cards, objects d'art, flowers, skulls, etc., belong to a specific field of value: the private, the domestic, the gustatory, the convivial, the artistic, the vocation and avocation, the decorative and the sumptuous, and less often, in a negative mood, objects offered to meditation as symbols of vanity, mementos of the ephemeral and death. The still life objects bring awareness to the complexity of the phenomenal and the subtle interplay of perception and artifice in representation. I think that's one of the coolest quotes in the essay. It's like just really made me rethink how I look at still lives. And it's, yeah. I feel like I really appreciate still life more after like reading that and like internalizing it. So if the choices of objects in still life are not for just like pretext for the artist to experiment with methods of painting, what are they for? Shapiro feels that the genre of still life painting opens up to an endless variety of feelings and thoughts, even of a disturbing intensity. The objects may be instruments of a passion as well as of a cool meditation. In this expanded meaning of still lives, there's so much more room for the artist to express themselves. Might there also be room for a latent erotic sense, as Shapiro says, in that opened up space? This is when Shapiro finally explores the sexual desire in still life and answers the question, why apples? Shapiro gives a lot of reasons why apples. I think there's 3 main points he makes that are the most powerful to me. Cézanne once told a critic, quote, that he wishes to astonish Paris with an apple, unquote. A likely reading of this quote is a reference to the myth of the Judgment of Paris. So the Judgment of Paris was a myth in which there are 3 goddesses, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, who have agreed to let Paris of Troy choose the fairest one and reward her with a symbolic golden apple. All the goddesses, of course, bribed him because these were Greek gods and they loved corruption. And he chose Aphrodite because her bribe was the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. He then brings Helen to Troy, starting the Trojan War. This myth actually shows up earlier in Cézanne's work with references to the amorous shepherd. It's likely that the myth of the Judgment of Paris in part inspired that painting. Shapiro writes of this relation to myth. By connecting his favorite theme with the golden apples of myth, he gave it a grander sense and alluded to the dream of sexual fulfillment, which Freud and others of his time too readily supposed was the general goal of the artist's sublimating effort. Still life with plaster cast of amour, 1895. Another painting that Shapiro looks to connect the apples to sexual impulses. In this painting, we see a plaster statuette of Puget's Amour and a drawing of a cast of a courtier, an inwardly tormented nude, his upper part cut by the frame. We may regard this free and perhaps unreflective association of apples, Cupid, and a suffering nude man as an evidence of the connection of the apples and the erotic that we recognize in the amorous shepherd. In this canvas, the apples are grouped with onions, contrasted forms as well as savours that suggest the polarity of the sexes. Homage to woman. Last but not least, we have Shapiro's discussion of Homage to woman, or the eternal feminine, which was painted 1875 to 1877. He writes, in a watercolor sketch for this work, the figure closest to her brings apples and wine on a tray, a typical Cézanne still life and a constant motif in his pictures of debauch. So, yeah, I think there's definitely more to this essay that isn't captured here because the video would be 2 hours long and it would just be me reading the essay. But I think most of Shapiro's claims for the sexually charged apples has been captured here, and it's like definitely a wild claim to make. There's a lot of reason to doubt the conclusions he draws, and like many critics at the time did responding to this essay. Personally, I kind of find it convincing that Cézanne would have been thinking about the apples in this way, especially after the quote about women and about the reasons that he paints still lives. Additionally, it does a great job of explaining why Cézanne's artistic output went from very dark and violent images to more controlled and constrained images of fruit and like really controlled pictures of nudes. And it also explains why Cézanne would have put so much into these paintings. Like, these paintings are considered among his most prominent works, and it makes sense that if he had such intense feelings that he was channeling through the works, they would have been significant. But there's valid questions one might ask about this conclusion, one of which is Chapter 2. What is this all for? The place of interpretation in art history. So you might be wondering, like, what is this all for? Like, what do I care that this guy who died like 100 years ago, whether he painted apples because he just liked painting apples, or if he was a sexually frustrated guy? I would say to that, firstly, you and I might have very different interests. But secondly, like, I get it. I feel like even if we had Cézanne in the room right now and could ask him, like, why did you paint these apples? We might not even know. He could just lie. Like, it's impossible to know the artist's intent, but we can take some guesses. And some cultural theorists are even against interpretation as an idea, like, at all. Susan Sontag has an essay called Against Interpretation, in which she argues against interpretation. She says that we should just appreciate the sensual feeling of art for what it is on the canvas. So, to see the real value of interpretation, which I think there's some, sorry Sontag, we can do a little thought experiment. So let's imagine that Shapiro is dead wrong. Cézanne just really loved painting apples. He had no conscious or unconscious sexual desires associated with his paintings of apples. Was this a whole lot of spilled ink for nothing? What do we get from his analysis? Chapter 2.1, Active Imagination. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that even what is untrue in an art historical analysis can open opportunities for questions that get closer to the truth or open up new ways of thinking. Shapiro's essay was significant in its analysis that something as simple as a still life of an apple could be charged with meaning beyond, like, you know, the formulaic ones of memento mori, where a skull represents mortality and ephemerality, right? The apples are charged with meaning, and the energy on the canvas could be forced into a pinprick, constantly threatening to explode, but somehow staying in tension. This interpretation offers up Cézanne's still lifes as a precursor to later works in which this explosion is allowed to happen, right? Like Cubism or abstract expressionism and like German expressionism. And there are fragments all over the place. Meaning is exploded. Sometimes there's not even real like forms of objects. That is a major contribution of this essay, which is opening up the space of still lives to hold meanings beyond what you could previously expect. Chapter 2.2, Works of Art Await Use. One of my favorite art historians is John Berger, and he writes, "Works of art await use. The work enters the totality of what the present consciously inherits from the past. And in entering that totality, it changes it." The use that Berger is talking about is the use of understanding ourselves and our time. What a work means supersedes the meaning it had at the time of its creation and includes the meaning it has in our time right now. For Shapiro, the, quote, totality of what the present consciously inherits from the past included both Cézanne's paintings of apples and the psychological work of Freud. Shapiro's essays says something not only about the paintings, but about the cultural and critical landscape of the time. What we choose to write on and what lenses we use to interpret things matters. Chapter 2.3, Art Historical Progress. So it might seem silly to refer to a discipline with history in its title as having progress, but the discipline does change over time, and one of the significant changes happened in the 70s and 80s as art historical intersectional feminist approaches entered into the discourse. Among other things, this led to a whole lot of art and artists who would have been ignored previously, specifically people of color and women, to be discovered and to be critically analyzed by art history. One of these feminist art historians, Patricia Mathews, wrote a paper called Gender Analysis and the Work of Meyer Schapiro. In it, she notes how, quote, one can assess Shapiro's sensitivity to gender issues, which would eventually give rise to feminist approaches to art history. The essay is fascinating and probably deserves like a whole video of its own. I would encourage you to read it. I'll just highlight some of the parts that I found most interesting. So Shapiro describes the faceless models that Cézanne's later nude works would include as being controlled nudes. And he also describes the constraining order of the apple still lives. And so taking this all together, Mathews writes, by juxtaposing such loaded terms as imposition and facelessness with constraining order as a form of content, Shapiro suggests that Cézanne has metaphorically dominated and restrained the nude body of women through formal means. Indeed, the absorption of these bodies into the subsuming and directive overall texture and stroke of the painting seems to lock their bodies into place and insistently control them. Shapiro thus indicates a recognition of the role of such artistic strategies in the oppression of women. And that's something you can see in the paintings, the control of women's bodies. It's really not hard to see when you kind of notice it and know the background. So next time you see a Cézanne painting, think of his misogyny. Think of the way that he's constructing women's bodies and confronting them, and perhaps controlling them in his compositions. Conclusion. I've been fortunate enough to see some of Cézanne's still lifes with apples in person, and they are lovely, despite me thinking that they're probably a representation of his repressed sexual desires. They're lovely enough to have inspired Shapiro to write an in-depth psychoanalysis of them. And even if you don't like Shapiro's analysis, which is very valid, and it definitely feels like reach, so you're valid if you don't believe me, I hope it has helped you to think about the place of theory and interpretation in art history, and some of the contributions it made, I think really has affected the way that I see art. I feel like I have a greater appreciation for still lives, and just a greater appreciation for the meanings that paintings can hold. For me, it illustrates one of my favorite parts of art history, which is that new questions about old works of art can open up new creative paths and make us think about creativity itself and our role within the creative process.